Welcome everyone to AURI Connects Webinar Wednesday, part of AURI Connects monthly online series featuring updates on the work AURI is doing to foster long-term economic benefit for Minnesota through value-added agricultural products. I'm Dan Scogan, the AURI Director of Government and Industry Relations, and your host on Webinar Wednesdays. The AURI Connects program is hosted by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute in Minnesota. This program aims to actively engage all participants in the food and ag industry to improve competitiveness of producers, businesses, and entrepreneurs through ongoing, purposeful connection of resources and partners along the value chain, and increased knowledge of opportunities, technologies, and trends. Remember that this event is being recorded and archived and can be found at auri.org. Also remember that you will be muted during our presentations, but you can send us your written questions through the Q&A portal on your screen. Today we welcome a collaboration of participants from AURI, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, the Region 9 Development Commission, and the amazing Chickpea for a discussion around a study to assess Minnesota's food and beverage manufacturing capabilities. For perspective and background, let's welcome AURI's Business Development Director for Food, Jason Robinson. Jason?
Hi, Dan. Thanks for the introduction. And welcome to our webinar today, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Dan introduced, the Minnesota Department of Ag and AURI have connected on working together to commission a report to explore Minnesota's food and beverage manufacturing industry. Next slide, please. Our premise with this report has really focused on that there is a lack of capacity or access to affordable and right-sized manufacturing in Minnesota for growing and ready-to-scale food and beverage businesses. This assumption is really based on anecdotal evidence from scaling businesses themselves, as well as their support organizations, as well as qualitative data gathered by the Minnesota Department of Ag's Brian Erickson, who we'll hear from in a minute. So in response to this assumed problem statement, this premise that we have highlighted, is that a number of questions need to be explored. The first being, is this problem statement really the problem that needs to be solved? And as such, what is the associated economic opportunity? So in essence, we want to confirm the problem that we think needs to be solved. Secondly, this research is intended to identify what right-sized manufacturing capacity and capability already exists in Minnesota. Thirdly, what right-sized manufacturing capacity and capability needs to be built in order to support these growing food and beverage businesses in Minnesota and really support the ecosystem as a whole. And fourthly, what are the ecosystem hurdles to address this problem? Or in other words, how do we do what we need to do? What should the state and industry supporters actually move against in order to expand these local processing opportunities for scaling Minnesota food and bev companies? So AURI, with significant funding support from the MDA, contracted with the Region 9 Development Commission in Mankato, Minnesota, to research the various facets of this problem. Before we get into much of the detail, I'd like to introduce Brian Erickson from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, who is the New Market Program Manager in Ag Marketing and Development, and a longtime friend and promoter of Minnesota's small food and beverage ecosystem. Brian will provide the state perspective on this work. Brian, I'll leave it to you and you can advance to the next slide.
Well, thank you, Jason, and thank you to the AURI for this partnership and R9 and other partners as well. We really appreciate, though, in particular, our work with the AURI. It's always gratifying, and we hope it's productive for the state of Minnesota. And as Jason mentioned, I'm with the State Department of Agriculture in the Ag Marketing and Development Division. And we, utilizing a fund called the AURI Fund, started a program called the New Markets Program back in 2012, 2013. And through that program, we serve roughly 150, 155 small food companies and farms that offer value-added products with marketing support. And next slide, please. One of the questions that comes up often when we're working with small food companies, and one of the first hurdles that they arrive at when they're trying to build a sustainable business model is, should I self-manufacture or should I use a co-packer? And the food industry is brutally competitive, as many of you know. So they have a lot of hard decisions to make, and that's not an easy one. So they have to decide whether they're going to build something to make their product, or whether they're going to use somebody else to help them make their product if they're going to start to scale their business. So we started running into companies that were having trouble answering this question, and they were also having trouble finding co-packers to help them if they made the latter decision. Next slide, please. So what we did was we created a co-packer list, thinking we would solve the problem, right? And currently our co-packer list is online at the URL listed in the upper corner there. And it includes almost 50 co-packers in Minnesota that do various things. But invariably, we would still have a lot of people coming back to us and telling us they couldn't find somebody to make the product that they want made, or they couldn't find somebody that would take their business because they were too small. And so we also started to track exits from the industry as we tried to build this co-packer directory. In fact, I got an entry to the co-packer directory from a small company just yesterday, Olson Fish Company. So we're trying to add companies as we can, but it's a difficult business, as you can see. Next slide, please. So in tracking exits, we started to try and track, why people were going elsewhere to find their co-packing. And what we found, that there was no easy answer. Every company had a different situation, a different product. Some companies went to other states because they couldn't find that service here, and some companies left for other reasons. So what we found was more questions than answers, unfortunately, but it did add to the kind of collective knowledge around this topic. And so we started working with the AURI, next slide, please, to answer some of these kind of more broad questions that Jason already mentioned some of this, but so what could we do from the state's perspective to help keep that food manufacturing in Minnesota? That was the big question we were trying to answer. Would it be helpful to list more co-packers? Do we need to just do better matchmaking between co-packers and small food makers? Could we cultivate more local co-packers? Or are there incentives available that these people weren't finding to manufacture in Minnesota? So in tracking exits and in building this database, we just tried to help answer some of these questions, and then moving on to working with Jason, Michael, and Jen with AURI on this partnership. We hope to be able to add to that knowledge. And our perspective is more myopic to small food companies, but there is a broader opportunity here. Jason mentioned it as kind of a obstacle, but we like to view it as an opportunity. We think Minnesota has a lot of manufacturing capability, and we hope that we can add to the equation to keep that manufacturing and add to food manufacturing in Minnesota. So thank you very much for including us today, and I look forward to the rest of the presentation.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for giving us that perspective. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to do now, before we kick off into a little bit more detail around what we actually found and what we learned, is to take just a brief look at some of the key top-line findings. Our original approach really made sure that what we wanted to do was confirm our initial research premise. And what we found is that we not only confirmed that premise, but understood that the problem is bigger than just a Minnesota problem. So in essence, that affordable, accessible, and right-sized food and beverage manufacturing is not a Minnesota problem, but a national problem. What's interesting about that is that we also found Minnesota is uniquely positioned to lead in finding solutions. And I think that's a very interesting takeaway, that Minnesota can really lead the nation in terms of finding a solution or multiple solutions to solve what is truly a national problem. Additionally, through the economic analysis that Region 9 will share here shortly, is that Minnesota has a chance to unlock significant GDP growth or significant economic reward through investment in food and beverage manufacturing. And that ultimately, the solutions that can help us in this small food and beverage manufacturing ecosystem really must address multiple issues that are evident throughout this problem statement. The first is that we must address the availability of right-sized food and beverage manufacturing capacity. In other words, we have to understand whether or not the right capability and infrastructure does exist, but also is the manufacturer willing to work with small brands? And sometimes this disconnect is something that that really lends itself to being a part of the issue. Based on the economic analysis, a solution must also address how to encourage investment in food and beverage manufacturing to unlock that economic reward. We must also help in connecting small brands with the appropriate right-sized food and beverage manufacturing. Brian alluded to this in his comments, but what we found through this research, particularly as Region 9 was conducting this research, is that the data that is collected annually by the state to ensure the safety of food that's coming from Minnesota small food businesses could be an untapped resource to aid in this matchmaking exercise. The how is something that we need to go after in another phase of research, but it's very interesting to understand that the state is already collecting data that could be made to work harder for us in terms of solving this premise. And then finally, a solution must also address the barriers that exist between brands and manufacturers that often stem from a lack of effective communication or a lack of understanding of the business models that are impacted. So what I'd like to do now is to turn it over to Sunil Kumar, founder and owner of The Amazing Chickpea. The Amazing Chickpea is a small food business founded in 2016 here in Minnesota. And I'm asking Sunil to share with us his uniquely personal story and connection to many of the issues that we've talked about thus far. So Sunil, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jason. And thanks, Ari, and giving me the opportunity to actually tell my story. And I hope I represent most of the small food entrepreneurs in Minnesota because our story is pretty much similar. So as you can see the slide, I started with the chickpea butter spread, which is a nut-free, gluten-free spread for anybody who is allergic to nuts. So back in 2018, I started using a medium-sized co-packer. Up to 2017, I was making the product in a kitchen, shared kitchen, but when my volume started going up to thousands, then I had to look for a co-packer. So when we talk about the co-packers, the challenge actually we face is having a unique product. We are looking for a co-packer who meets those criteria and has the capacity and capability to be able to produce our products. So in my case, I was looking for a co-packer first who is nut-free facility, having a nut-free facility, also a gluten-free facility. And second thing is our product, the way it's made actually is unique. So do they have the equipments and the capability to make that product? So there is this challenge finding the right co-packer first who can meet those criteria. If that uniqueness that, it sometimes becomes a challenge to find a co-packer, that's one hurdle we face. And second thing is the minimum. So when we are starting in the kitchen, we are maybe making in hundreds. And then we went to a medium size, we get up to thousands. And then co-packers may be expecting, 100,000. Now the question is, how do we work with the co-packer in terms of that volume? Because then you have to put upfront so much cash to be able to make 100K units. So that's another challenge we face. So Anyway, going back to the original the discussion that's going on, yes, for as a small entrepreneur, as a small food producer, we have so many hurdles to go through. There might be co-packers available, those who can help us, but again, do they have capacity to help us? Second thing is that do they have the equipment to make the product? And third thing is, do they have those special criteria that meet gluten-free, nut-free? So these are the kind of steps one has to go through to kind of go to the list and call them up and find out if there's a match. And after getting that, then you have to shortlist, okay, which one is willing to work with you, because your minimum may not be the one that actually they want to produce for. So anyway, having said that, so back in 2018, we used medium-sized co-packer. Now back in 2019, we had to go out of state to find a co-packer which is a bigger capacity as our volume was growing. We couldn't find one here. And this year, actually, what we are trying to do is we are trying to manufacture ourselves. So we are setting up our manufacturing because we cannot just rely on co-packers anymore. It's just such a big struggle that you have to just go through it. So anyway, so that's my perspective. And if you have any questions or anything that you want to ask me specifically, I can go and I can talk about those too. Jason?
Thank you, Sunil. Much appreciated in terms of sharing your perspective with your experiences. Clearly, you have struggled through many of the issues that we have discussed. And frankly, your story is one that we have heard far too often as it relates to struggling food businesses that are looking for the solution to their manufacturing issues. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do next is I'd like to introduce the Region 9 Development Commission so that they can share their work as it relates to the economic assessment associated with this research. So what I'm going to do is introduce Sam Smith and Sean Schlusser of the Region 9 Development Commission, which serves 9 counties in South Central Minnesota in the areas of economic development, business development, healthy communities, transportation, community development, and leveraging regional resources. Sean Schlusser joined Region 9 in February 2019 after a long career in the Army and serving on the congressional staff of current Governor Tim Walz. Sean primarily works in community, economic, and workforce development, as well as regional and local transportation. And his partner today, Sam Smith, joined Region 9 in August of 2020 as an economic resiliency specialist, having previously worked in rural business development and nonprofit leadership throughout southern Minnesota since 2010 after a 5-year career as an award-winning newspaper reporter. Region 9 did some amazing work as it relates to an economic assessment, but the research that they completed wouldn't be 100% complete without the help of another partner, Food Ops, led by Jim Costello. Food Ops lent a very unique perspective into identifying key hurdles for small businesses in the food and beverage manufacturing space. So we want to thank Food Ops as well for their insights into this research. Now I'd like to turn it back over to Sam and to Sean so that they can help walk us through the economic assessment that they completed on behalf of the Minnesota Department of Ag and AURI through this research. Sam and Sean?
Well, thanks, Jason. I appreciate that warm introduction. And I also appreciate you mentioning Jim Costello and Food Ops, LLC. Without their partnership, this report couldn't have been as good as it turned out. So we're very grateful for their input and their expertise. And both Sam and I are happy to be here today as we share those findings that Sam eloquently coined as being hidden in plain sight, because that's truly where we feel they are. And as you mentioned earlier, Jason, Minnesota can lead in finding these solutions. And Minnesota can also unlock growth in gross domestic product through investments in food and beverage manufacturing. Next slide, please. So here's where we are. Minnesota's observed gross domestic product for 2019, not seasonally adjusted, is over $380.8 billion. Now, it's possible to derive estimates for the food and beverage manufacturing industry as it pertains to both revenues and employment. The data shows that the food and beverage manufacturing industry affects 60% of the state's GDP, or $226.8 billion. So imagine if we could make improvements of just a 5% gain for food and beverage manufacturing industry. How would that impact Minnesota's GDP? How would that be reflected across all industries in terms of employment? And so with that, we want to look at how we line up against the rest of the United States. Next slide, please. Minnesota is the 8th largest food and beverage. Can you go back a slide, please? So there we go. Thank you. Minnesota is the 8th largest food and beverage manufacturing state when you look at the number of jobs. Employment in that industry accounts for more than 30,000 jobs. The Twin Cities ranks 5th for employment among metropolitan statistical areas, of which there are close to 380. When viewed by the number of establishments, Minnesota ranks 11th, as does the Twin Cities amongst all the MSAs. So this means that we are well positioned to lead the nation in these industries. Next slide. If you look at the ratio of the distribution of employment, where 1 is the same share of employment as the rest of the nation and the remainder of the states, Minnesota places number 13 against other states for employment in the food and beverage manufacturing industry. Minnesota weighs in at 38% higher than the national average. This reaffirms that critical nature of food and beverage manufacturing industry to the state's overall economic functioning and workforce employment. Next slide, please. In viewing the quarterly workforce indicators, they allow a comparison of employment over time for manufacturing. And through linear modeling, we can also make predictions towards the future. We have 35 years worth of historical data, which is considered very robust for forecasting purposes. Researchers expect a decrease in employment figures for all manufacturing, including food, over the next 10 years, which is consistent with data from other manufacturing industry. However, beverage manufacturing will experience growth over the next 10 years, though the growth will be slow. Labor participation rates have stagnated since 2000 at historically high rates. All but one region in Minnesota has a participation rate of over 80% amongst the 20 to 64-year-olds. Barriers to employment are keeping the remaining 20% out of the workforce. Next slide, please. Despite its traditionally strong performance in the food and beverage manufacturing sector, Minnesota is 32nd among states for overall growth rates, with the cumulative growth that lags the national average indicated by a ratio of 0. This decline is also evident in growth of food and beverage consumer establishments, in which Minnesota ranks number 38. When we looked at growth in US patents, the food and beverage manufacturing cluster per 10,000 employees, Minnesota again ranks 32 nationally for growth in US patents. So Minnesota has forfeited a significant share of its competitive advantage over the last 2 decades. And without intervention, there's little reason to believe that this trend will change. And although this revelation is distressing, it also suggests that the food and beverage industry is ripe for investment and growth. Sam, can you tell us a little more about why?
I'll try. Thanks, Sean. Thanks for setting this up. So if we go to the next slide, please. I'm going to try to not bore you to tears with what we call an input-output analysis. But the long and short of it is, if we advance to the next slide, through this system called RIMS2, which is Regional Input Output Modeling System. It's an economic assessment tool from the Department of Commerce, from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And we requested statewide, regional, and industry-specific, they call them multipliers, but effectively it's just a list of numbers that says, if you turn one dial, how does that affect the rest of the economy, right? And so referencing that with this picture here of an interconnected node and very impressively engineered web, if you were to remove or alter or increase or decrease the tension on one node, the RIMS2 analysis tries to assess or estimate what the downstream impact would be. For the purposes of this assessment, we used 3 primary metrics. The Bureau of Economic Analysis calls them value added, which is not to be confused with value added ag. In this instance, it's a surrogate for gross domestic product, right? So one industry's impact or downstream interconnected impact effect on the entire gross domestic product of the rest of the state, including that industry. Secondly, earnings, pretty self-explanatory. It's an hourly figure. So how much, if you put $1 in, how much comes back out in terms of increased or decreased average hourly wages? And then employment, similarly, put $1 in, or in this case, $1 million in, and what comes out in terms of the number of jobs added to the overall workforce throughout the state. Again, this is not specific to the industry, but the point being, if you were to invest in food and beverage manufacturing, the numbers that come back out are reflective of what you would expect to see across the state, including food and beverage manufacturing. Next slide, please. So maybe we blew the powder a little bit early here, but the big finding, and what none of us, I think, expected to see, was that in Minnesota, food and beverage manufacturing has the highest return to the statewide GDP out of any industry, or could reasonably be expected to. So in other words, for $1 invested into food and beverage manufacturing, you could expect to see $2.84.3 come back out in various ways in the statewide economy. That's a big deal. And this is back to Sean's reference of 5% increase and 5% growth. The reason we put that number out there is we believe it to be reasonable, and we also believe it to be potentially a very dramatic impact on the overall statewide economy. Next slide, please. Turning your attention to earnings, and what you see is that there's a disconnect between where the statewide return on investment in terms of GDP and overall growth, economic growth, is not reflected in workforce earnings. So what my colleague suggests to me, an economist colleague, and you'll have to ask him for a more detailed explanation of why this is, but I can tell you that he tells me that there are 2 possible explanations for this. One of which is that the food and beverage manufacturing industry operates with a high degree of leverage, meaning debt and loan, and or is labor intensive. Or secondly, that, and this to the point here of what we're, for the purpose of this study, it's kind of interesting that the other possible explanation is that synergies and co-manufacturing and industry connections and all these networks that could potentially tighten up and get closer and closer are not, for whatever reason. They're disparate, and therefore there is a disconnect between the potential return to the statewide economy and the number of earnings and jobs. So next slide, please. Jobs, it's a similar story. The disconnect again between the worker, the workforce, and the overall economy looks to be very pretty stark here. And again, my economist friend and colleague tells me that more likely the reason for this is option B from above, that tightening some of those networks, reinforcing some of those synergies, tightening those loops, getting people talking, helping make connections as the investment goes up, that the employment and earnings could reasonably be expected to start to catch up with where the GDP impact is. And bullet number 2 here, just to point out that even though they're much lower than number 1, they're still the top 15 in the state for earnings and employment. So even though there is a disconnect and there's obvious room for growth, it's not any reason to call it bad. It's still a very strong industry. It's just there's room for increased connection. So next slide, please. Part of this report was taking a more macro or mid-level look at some of the impact of food and beverage manufacturing regionally. So what we did was take a look at our own sort of selfishly South Central Minnesota region. And what we found was that probably won't be much surprise to those of you who are from South Central Minnesota who are on the call, but all 3 multipliers, GDP, earnings, and employment, are food and beverage manufacturing related in terms of the top 5. So for instance, in value-added GDP, the first, in fact, all 5 of the top value-added GDP contributing industries are food and beverage manufacturing related. And so from a statewide perspective, it's less important, this figure is, than it is for various regional development organizations, such as ours and other local and regional economic assessment agencies, to be able to take a look and see, is food and beverage manufacturing having the impact on our area that it is on the rest of the state, or that it is on Region 9. So next slide, please. We talk about the bottom line. I'll ask Sean to come back around because you're all tired of hearing about the input-output analysis, and thank you for not falling asleep on me. Sean, tell them what it means.
That was exciting, Sam. Thank you. Well, what we found was that the food and beverage manufacturing industry affects Minnesota's economy stronger than any other industry in our state, and it truly appears to be an untapped driver of growth. Next slide. So here's why. The data shows that the food and beverage manufacturing industry affects 60% of the state's GDP, or $226 billion of the total, not seasonally adjusted for 2019. The data also suggests that the industry is too labor intensive to grow earnings with an associated growth in output, or the industry suffers from underutilized capacity sharing when it comes to co-manufacturing. So imagine if we could make improvements of just a 5% gain in output for the food and beverage manufacturing industry. That would generate more than $11 billion in statewide GDP and create close to 168,000 jobs statewide across all industries. So we encourage the state of Minnesota to look closer at these opportunities. Thank you. Jason, back to you.
Thanks, Sean and Sam. That was quite informative, quite in depth, and we appreciate the time and energy that you put into helping us truly understand and recognize the opportunity that is sitting in front of us. And like Sam had mentioned, that truly is hidden in plain sight. I think we understand that Minnesota as a state is heavily dominated by med tech and now the high tech industries, and investment in food and beverage, particularly in food and beverage manufacturing, is something that could certainly help to grow our overall GDP, and is certainly something that by rights Minnesota should be leading the nation in, given the historical perspective that Minnesota is really where the food industry began, on the banks of the Mississippi River, with the huge flour mills from the precursors to both the Pillsbury Company and the General Mills Company. So we appreciate your time, and thank you so much for your comments. Next slide, please. So what we wanted to do was finish up today's conversation with a little bit of what's next. A little bit of a perspective around where we want to take what we've learned and move it into an action steps phase. So first and foremost, we are currently working to formalize the findings that Sean and Sam went through, together with a number of other findings, into a research report that will be posted publicly. I saw one of the questions in the chat that was curious about what might be made available following this webinar. And what we will make available are the slides that Sean and Sam have used today to allow for you to use some of the data that has already been made public. And we will continue to formalize that report at a later time, hopefully over the course of the next 3 to 4 weeks. And that is our plan. Secondly, and this is really where the rubber hits the road, in a sense, is in true Minnesota fashion, what we need to do is really look at forming a task force to develop actionable strategies that are focused on answering many of the questions that were raised today, and to really put into effect this research that we've been able to highlight. So first and foremost, we learned that there's a significant amount of economic reward available if we can invest. So what we need to figure out is how can we identify opportunities to encourage public and or potentially private investment into the food and beverage manufacturing sector to really help unlock this GDP growth. Secondly, we need to take all this information that we have, wherever it is, and transform it into knowledge. So in a sense, transforming information into knowledge. And I alluded to this a bit in my preamble, which is really in the case of the food safety data that is collected annually to support effective matchmaking between brand and manufacturer. That's just one example. And many more exist to help us get to this stage of being able to effectively support the multi-pronged solutions that will be necessary to help the small food and beverage ecosystem achieve right-sized manufacturing scale. And finally, and this hasn't really come up previously in this webinar, but we also know that we need to close the ecosystem knowledge, communication, and manufacturing capability gaps. So this really looks like being able to make sure that the small brands understand how to communicate effectively with the contract manufacturers, for instance, or to help contract manufacturers or manufacturers in general better understand the expectations and the needs of these small scale businesses as we move into the future. So as I mentioned, our next steps are really focused on getting a task force together to put this research into action. So if you have thoughts, if you have additional questions, what we'd like to do is have you contact myself at jrobinson@auri.org or Brian Erickson at the address that you see here, and let us know your thoughts. Let us know if you're willing to be contacted. The more information that we can gather, the bigger the insights that we can understand, the more likely it is that we can truly help Minnesota lead as a solution provider and not only prevent what we think is happening, which is small businesses being forced to go wherever they need to in order to find the next stage of their manufacturing capacity, but also to attract new businesses here. Because we do think there is a potential to use whatever strategy we can define to attract new businesses and unlock even more GDP growth for the future. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for being here today. And I think what we can do now is move into the Q&A portion of our chat this afternoon now. And I would like to kick it off. I'm going to take some time to moderate these questions, and I'll call on our panelists today as appropriate to provide some perspective on some of these questions. To the first question that we received is really around, is it possible to create a public and private partnership manufacturing platform to support right-sized commercialization for small-scale businesses? So I will take that one right off the bat and say that the short answer is yes, I'm sure it's possible, and we want to explore those solutions. And there likely is a solution that will require both public and private partnerships, but we need to be careful to avoid public ownership of the economic opportunity that's presented by a potentially partially publicly owned approach to solving the manufacturing platform issue. So I think the answer is likely yes, but we need to figure out what that partnership looks like. We've had a number of different discussions internally as an action team that could potentially consist of something to the point of incentives to invest. And that might be what it looks like. But at this point, we certainly need to explore the potential solutions.
Jason,
Sam?
can I?
Yeah, please
can I
go
jump
ahead.
on that? Yeah, this is Sam. And not making any recommendation on one way or the other, but I can say that these economic analyses with the regional input-output modeling system are almost always done in the setting of it being both, right? There being some degree of private investment and some degree of public investment in whatever the project or initiative is. Of course, the degrees vary and they're not always collaborative, but most of them usually are. When you see like a 5% increase as a figure, as a number, just for easy math, that would be 2.5% public, 2.5% private. Doesn't mean that's the right answer, but there's usually some sort of balance of both in that investment.
Thanks, Sam. Great. Well, I will move on to the second question, and this question is for Sunil. Sunil, what challenges are similar and different in setting up your own production locally versus working with a co-packer? Can you comment a little bit on some of the challenges you've experienced as you're looking to get your own location set up?
Sure. So right now I'm going through the same process of setting up my manufacturing. So one of the, of course, first thing is to finding a place where you can set up your manufacturing. So finding a location, whether it's already pre-built for the food grade manufacturing. In our case, it's not. So I have to go through of setting up some fixtures in there first to get that set up to meet all the MDA inspection and the requirements. And after that, and also procuring the equipments that I need for producing the product. Now, so there is a lot of actually capital investment I'm making right now in order to get that manufacturing set up. But at the same time, when I've seen the other side of using the co-packers, where I recently went through a painful process of a co-packer where their trial run of half-day production run was $7,000 for me to find out if they will be able to make my product. And since I was getting orders and I was at risk, and I went through their trial process because we did a couple of benchtop, and then we did 2 trial run and 15,000 investment, and they both failed. So after investing 15,000 and plus, we lost about 6-7 pallets of product. I realized that this is not working. So that's where actually I moved in the direction of setting up my own manufacturing, because that investment I can make into the equipments. But with the co-packer, as I said, the minimums could be high. So they could say, hey, I can make your product, and then I have to have minimum your 100,000 units. 100,000 units may translate into $50,000. Do you have that? Do we have that kind of cash to put up front to co-packer? And where do you warehouse that product? And if your co-packer is actually out of state, then the freight, shipping out your ingredients over there and warehousing it there. And most of the co-packers, once the production is done, within 2 weeks, they want the product out of their warehouse. They don't want to keep it there. I had a co-packer in California who actually threw my stuff, a couple of pallets, actually, within a production was done. So these are the things that you have to deal with the co-packers. So there are both actually challenges on both sides. Just one has to look at what works for your situation, and decide what makes sense. To me, I've come down to the solution that, okay, I need to do my own manufacturing. First, of course, I have better control, self-reliant, and quality. And if you're looking for line time for the co-packers, they may not give it to you. And sometimes you go through a process of co-packer. Like 6 months ago, I went through co-packer with 3 months of analysis and everything, and they agreed, okay, they'll produce. But then when they come to production, they didn't produce. They said, we can't do it because we got some big CPG company giving us $500,000, contract. You have to wait for another 3 months and already have orders coming in. So I'm like, where do I go now? So those are the challenges. You'll have to assess what makes sense, So I hope I was able to give some picture, not in a very negative way, but at least the reality of what we deal with.
Thanks, Sunil, and stay off mute because we've got a couple more questions for you. The next one is related to what you have, what you have shared about your manufacturing capacity, and that is, where did you find investment dollars to actually begin setting up your own production?
So honestly, it's my personal funding. I didn't look for investors because there's a lot of actually steps you have to go through and what kind of investor you want to look for. So I've been using mostly my personal investment to do kind of capital investment into the equipment. But what I have done actually is, in my case, is that it took me a couple of years to kind of pre-process the way my product is made. So I want to minimize, when I am producing the product, minimize the equipment side of it there, so that it doesn't take heavy duty equipment to produce my product. And be a little bit more smart and efficient in terms of throughput. So some of those measures I took into consideration. So I'm not trying to buy a $100,000 machine or equipment, I'm just trying to stay within the range which I can handle. And if things go in the right direction, then maybe upgrade the equipment. So taking a baby step. So okay, if my capacity is I need to produce, let's say 5,000 units or 10,000 units per day today, what equipments do I need to have today? I'm not thinking, okay, tomorrow do I need 20,000 units production per day? Then what do I need to do that? So it's just baby step, I would say. And again, it's personal investment mostly. So those are the risks one has to take, So, and to me, I always tell people, hey, there's only one life to live. So just see what makes sense to you. If it's your dream, if it's in your heart, just follow it and do it. And that's what I'm doing.
Great. Thanks, Sunil. And one more quick one for you, because I think that we have a number of small businesses that are online that are interested in your story. Have you ever experienced a cost for test runs with a new manufacturer? So as you had alluded to the fact that you were working with another manufacturer, and do they charge you for those test runs?
Sorry, I was mute. Yeah, just as I mentioned that about 3 months ago, I ran the test run with a co-packer, and they charged me for their half-day plant run, which is $7,000. So, and I was at risk because I knew I'm going for this particular business side because it was a special packaging requirement, basically the cups. I wanted to made those cups and bulk, So that's a co-packer I found. But in order to do manufacturing with them, they wanted to do the trial run to make sure they can produce 10,000 units or 20,000 units with their setup. And for that, we had to do the trial run. And for trial run cost, it'd be $7,000 per half day run. And that's what we paid. So, and unfortunately it failed. And that's where I just decided, okay, this is not gonna work. So I have to get into some of manufacturing too.
Thank you, Sunil. Your insights are very much appreciated. We have about 5 minutes left, so unfortunately we'll not be able to get through every single question that we did receive today. So we will get to all that we can. But one of the questions that did come up in the chat that I thought was interesting, and Brian, I think you can provide some perspective here too, is that Minnesota is home to a number of very large food and beverage companies. Can they help us solve this right-sized manufacturing problem for small food businesses? And I think, Brian, I'd really like to hear your perspective here as you've been in this role and working with food companies for many years. I can tell you that, from my background, having come from a large company like that, they certainly have an interest in solving this right-sized manufacturing problem. And selfishly, in order to support their own innovation platforms. Currently, their large-scale manufacturing platforms are built in order to run the same product to fit a national audience on a day-after-day basis. And being able to break into that production for a small-scale innovation opportunity is actually quite expensive and significantly impacts the margin requirements for these large-scale manufacturers. So they have an interest. I think the important thing to remember is that we don't have an answer, and that the role that the Fortune 500 food companies can play is really TBD as we move into the next phase of this work. Brian, anything that you would like to add as it relates to the big companies in Minnesota that might be able to play a role?
I'm not sure that I have a lot to add to that, Jason. I will say that General Mills, Land O'Lakes, and others have been very supportive of small food in Minnesota in ways other than processing. And what we have seen is companies like General Mills and Land O'Lakes looking at small food innovation to try and bring it in-house, and it hasn't always been successful. So they're wrestling with their own demons in regard to innovation. And although I think they could be valuable partners, they also have their own motivations. And so we need to tread lightly on those motivations and make sure that we understand that although they can be great partners, they also are competitors in some sense with some products that are being developed. So the answer is maybe, I guess.
Can I add something to it, Jason, if you don't mind?
Absolutely, please do.
So, I mean, if you remember, you and I spoke about a little bit on that topic that, what could be done, right? I understand that as the state and MDA and Department of Ag, may not have everything they can help out, just, okay, set up a new facility or things like that, but they may have tools that they could potentially use. So, for example, the way I'm looking at, again, I could be wrong in my, suggestion, is that they give subsidies to the companies and the grants and the funding, right? So maybe there is some portion of it they can say they need to help out as part of that, giving back of that grant or money or subsidy they're getting from the government is just help out the small entrepreneurs. So in my case, right, for example, if I had a leased facility to produce, that would have helped too, right? Or any other help that I can get. I mean, I'm not saying the big guys come in and help, right? But at least, some sort of help that way, they can continue their, production or whatever the help they need. It's not like they're just completely out of, luck. Because I know a couple of local entrepreneurs, their co-packers said, hey, we're not gonna produce your product. Guess what? Some of them actually are closing businesses now because they're tired. We move from co-packer to co-packer. And if some co-packer says no, and that's the only co-packer you could work with after finding a couple of years, then you're out of luck and then you have to close your shop.
Again, thank you so much for your perspective, Sunil. I think that it's really important to hear those stories of those individuals who are going through it. We get to sit in a little bit of a a little bit of a bubble as it relates to seeing the impact, but when you're actually living it and going through it, that personal story is so important to understanding what it is that we are, that you're experiencing, and really bring that story to life. So thank you again. I will say that we are out of time for today's webinar. And so what I'd like to do is just say thank you to everyone. And Dan, I will turn it back over to you to close us out. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen today.
Thank you, Jason. As Jason points out, that will conclude AURI Connects Webinar Wednesday for today. We want to thank all of the presenters today, and to you that participated as well, who took the time to join us. AURI Connects Webinar Wednesday is presented by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute of Minnesota. AURI's mission is to foster long-term economic benefit for Minnesota through value-added agricultural products and processes. We are interested in your feedback, so please respond when we send you our event evaluations. And remember, for more information on today's program or any of the work that AURI is involved with, you can go to auri.org. Now, on March 10th, our webinar Wednesday will be Paving the Way for Ag-Based Asphalt Preservation Solutions. Dr. Jimmy Gossi will guide participants on a 5-year road trip through the AURI case study on the use of replay, agricultural oil and preservation agent by the city of Hutchinson. You can sign up now to learn more about an agriculturally derived and exciting option to reduce transportation maintenance costs while preserving Minnesota roads. You can always learn more about other work that AURI is involved with by going online to auri.org. We'll see you on March 10th for another AURI Connects Webinar Wednesday.